Welcome to the Better Questions podcast. Today, we are really excited to be talking to a person who all three of us have been nerding out a little bit for, Dr. Robert Alter. He is a Jewish Old Testament scholar. He's written some staples in biblical studies when it comes to books like The Art of Biblical Narrative and also The Art of Biblical Poetry. And in 2018, he just released a massive 3-volume translation of the entire Hebrew Bible.
Like you do.
Yeah, exactly.
Let me just translate it all.
Which is super helpful and amazing. It's won him the Penn Center Literary Award and the Koret Jewish Book Award for translation. And in his spare time, he's the professor of Hebrew and comparative literature at the University of California at Berkeley.
And you can find him in the back of any book on the Bible in the notes and references, because he is most likely referenced.
Right. Yeah,
that
you may not.
Is pretty much true.
Yeah, casual Bible readers may not know who he is, but trust us when we say this is like all of the people you respect and admire that interpret the Bible. Those people read this guy's books.
Is he like the LeBron James of like Hebrew scholarship?
I think so.
Or up there? I don't know.
So we are really excited, like Chris said. And this is our interview with Robert Alter.
So what we wanted to do in this interview was have him talk about the book of Jonah, because we think that that's a fascinating book. We think it's a book that we need to be asking a lot of better questions on. And we thought it would be really cool to have Dr. Alter talk about the book of Jonah and use that as a way to expose us to all the amazing work that he's done.
And so Dr. Alter helps us re-examine the old ancient book of Jonah that you've all heard in Sunday school and ask new, insightful, and helpful questions.
Roll it.
And also,
so much from stuff that you've done, like Art of Biblical Narrative and some of those types of things, and then also through all of your extensive work with translations. And so what we thought would be kind of cool is, instead of just asking questions about all of those individual works, if we could pick a book from the Hebrew Bible and kind of talk about that book as a way to reflect all of those things that you have brought out from your work, if that makes sense. And we are fascinated with the book of Jonah, but I also know from the Christian perspective, it's one that it just seems like so many Christians miss so much of what's there. And so I really would love just to ask you a bunch of questions and hear you talk about it from your perspective, talk about some of the narrative things, all of that kind of stuff, if that's cool. So what I'd love to start with, if you wouldn't mind for a minute, is to just have you tell us a little bit about yourself and about your work.
I had always been fascinated by the Bible, and especially at the time by biblical narrative, and wondered what was so remarkable about it when it seemed to be rather simple. You know, it was very spare and seemed to use a limited range of means. And about 15 years into my career, I thought, well, I do have some notion now of what's going on in biblical narrative. And I wrote one article on the need for a literary perspective on the Bible, which I thought was going to be strictly a one-off thing. But it got a big response, many letters to me personally and to the editor. So I figured, well, I have some more ideas on biblical narrative, and I'll write another article. And pretty soon I had 4 articles in print, and I was on my way to writing the book that became The Art of Biblical Narrative, which has now been continuously in print about 37 years. I still thought, well, I'm not really technically a biblical scholar, so I've finished this book and that's it. But then the book was very well received, so I thought, why not a book on biblical poetry? And at that point, I had slid down the slippery slope into biblical studies. And so I continued to write articles on the Bible, and then by kind of happenstance, I ended up trying to do a translation of the book of Genesis, thinking that it was a rather quixotic undertaking, because what I was attempting to do was to get into English something of the stylistic power and subtlety of the Hebrew, which I felt hadn't been done by previous translators, and that it probably would not work because the structure of the two languages is so different, and the range of meanings of key terms in the two languages is so different. But it turned out to be rather better an approximation of what I had aspired to do than I thought, and it was well received. So I went on to do another book, and then another book, the Hebrew Bible, and in the end, I realized that I had not dreamt of doing this, but that I had done almost 2/3 of the books of the Hebrew Bible, and that with a big push, especially getting through the prophets, which were especially challenging, I could do the whole thing, and I have now done the whole thing, and it's out in 3 very large, handsome volumes produced by W. Norton. So in a nutshell, that's the story of how I came to biblical studies.
That's awesome. Before we jump into the book of Jonah, I'd love to ask, what were some of the biggest takeaways from you when it comes to that whole process of translating?
Well, the first takeaway is what I would call humility. That is, you realize that you can't altogether do what you want to do. And at times you're faced with more or less impossible choices where you have to sacrifice one thing in order to achieve another. I'll give you an example.
Yes, please.
This is something that ended up being a slightly clunky choice on my part, but I felt I had to make it. Everybody knows about Adam and Eve, right? But actually, there is no Adam in the Hebrew of the garden story. There is a first human creature who is called the Adam. Now, with the exception of oddities like the Donald, if you put a "the" before, yeah, I shouldn't have mentioned that, but if you put a "the" before what is generally a proper name, it can't be a proper name, but it's a common noun, and what it means is the Adam in biblical Hebrew means person or human, and that's what it means. So it's not a name, but the, no, you can't say person. So I said the human. And I realized that sounds a little weird. He created the human. And it did enable me to reproduce a pun in the Hebrew that is in the second version of creation. He created the human humus from the soil. In the Hebrew, it's the word for soil is Adamah, and the word for human is Adam. But you see what I mean? That in order, maybe my translation choice jolted the reader into a certain recognition, which is a good thing, but it probably annoyed readers, some readers, because it seems so strange.
Well, I appreciate you giving us that example. And I know I said that I would love for us to kind of walk through the book of Jonah. We've got some questions we'd love to ask you about it. Yeah. So from our perspective, we're coming from the Christian tradition, and you're coming from the Jewish tradition. What are maybe some ways you have seen those two traditions read the story of Jonah differently?
Well, of course, as I'm sure you're aware, and many of the listeners to this podcast will be aware, the traditional way of the Christian way of reading what was called the Old Testament was to read it as a prefiguration of the full revelation of the divine truth in the New Testament. This way of reading was called typological. That is, the various figures in the Old Testament were seen as prefigurations of the ultimate story that you get in the Gospels in the New Testament. So, for example, the binding of Isaac, which interestingly in Christian tradition is called the sacrifice of Isaac, is seen as a prefiguration or a typological first expression of the crucifixion and the resurrection. So, in the case of the book of Jonah, Jonah's descent into the belly of the big fish was not really called a whale in the original, is seen as Christ 3 days after the crucifixion, before the resurrection. And of course, Jonah does come out of the sea and the belly of the big fish. Now, let me say right away that to say that the typological reading, which has a certain symbolic beauty for sure, is not an authentic reading of the Hebrew text, is not just a kind of Jewish resistance to the Christian take on Hebrew scripture, but it's the almost universal view of modern biblical scholars, Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, and secular. That is, scholars today assume, and that certainly is my assumption, that that writings in Hebrew produced several hundred years before Christian scripture were not prophecies of Christian scripture. And that's certainly the way I read Jonah. Now, I can go on with that, but why don't you ask further questions?
Yeah, so I think that with any reading of scripture, taking some of the context into consideration is important. So what do you think is really important about understanding the relationship between Israel and Assyria for the story, and what do we miss from the story when we don't pay attention to that?
Okay, let me first briefly set the book in an approximate historical context.
Perfect, thank you.
We know for sure that it's a late biblical book. How do we know this for sure? Well, the Hebrew language, just like any language, like English, evolves over time. So I would say that the difference between the Hebrew of Genesis or the Hebrew of the Book of Samuel and the Hebrew of Jonah is roughly the distance between the English of Shakespeare and our English today. So there are various ways in terms of vocabulary, idioms, even grammar. You can tell that the Book of Jonah was written in the late biblical centuries. Maybe I am guessing the 5th century before the Christian era. Okay. Now, what had occurred by then with monotheism is that it had become much more insistently universalist than it was in the early centuries of the biblical period. So you have a writer, we don't really know anything about him biographically or what his very specific historical context was. So you have a writer who is strongly impelled by the vision of the universality of the God of Israel. In other words, he's not just a national God, but he's a God of the whole wide world. And so he frames this story, which is a kind of, I would say, a parable about biblical prophecy. That is, it doesn't seem that this Jonah was a historical figure. He takes his name, Jonah the son of Amittai, from a prophet who is mentioned only in passing in the Book of Kings. And we know nothing about that prophet, which may have made him a convenient hook to hang the name on, or a convenient name to use for this story. And maybe the two names were useful. That is, Jonah means dove in Hebrew, and perhaps we're supposed to recall a bit of the flood story, where there's a universal cataclysm, and Noah sends out the dove to see if the waters of the flood have receded. And the last, not the last name, but the patronymic, Amittai, seems to incorporate the Hebrew word for truth. So that may get into the picture as well. Now, let me, since you asked about Assyria, let me say something about the slight oddity of Assyria in this story. Assyria, of course, is an arch enemy of the people of Israel. The Assyrian Empire is the empire that utterly destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel, probably around 721 BC, and that exiled most of the population. That's how the 10 lost tribes got lost. So they're really bad guys. This book was written several centuries after the Assyrian Empire ceased to exist. There was no longer any Assyria when the book was written. So Assyria becomes a kind of parable of the enemy kingdom, the axis of evil, you might say, which nevertheless is under God's providence and care.
Thank you so much for that. Gosh, this is it's amazing to have you on. And I was wondering if we could shift the conversation just a little bit. And our podcast is all about trying to bring unity to really not even just the Christian faith, but to different perspectives, and to ask questions that call us all into action rather than just are just exercises. And with that in mind, you're probably aware of how divisive that this book can be, specifically in the Christian tradition. I'm not aware if it is in the Jewish tradition, but in our tradition, this book ends up being kind of like a litmus test for whether so if you believe that this story is history and literally happened, then you believe in a God that can do miracles and is the God of the Bible. But if you say no, if you look at it from a literary perspective, perhaps historical accuracy isn't really the chief takeaway here. Even if you just present that as an option, people say, well, you don't have faith that God could keep a man alive in the belly of a fish. So, if this book isn't true, then it throws out the whole Bible as any part of it being true. And we have really encountered both of those perspectives in each one of us in our faith journey as Christians. But I wondered if you could speak to that and how that might be misguided.
Yeah, I think it is misguided alternatives. That is, the truth comes through many channels. There is a literal truth, like let's say, did the prophet Isaiah exist, and did he deliver these prophecies in the kingdom of Judah in the waning years of that kingdom? The answer is yes, and those prophecies have great power, moral power, I think, right down to our own historical moment. And then there is another kind of truth, and I used the word parallel before. Let me point to a couple of things, a couple of details in the book of Jonah that really don't have anything to do with miracles or God's intervening in human affairs, but rather with, let's call it realism. That is, there are a couple of ways in which you can clearly see that the author of Jonah is not interested in realism. He's getting at the truth in a different way. Okay, one has to do with the dimensions of Nineveh. It is said to be a 3 days walk of a man from end to end. Now, if you do a little arithmetic, let's say a healthy person walking at a respectable pace could probably cover at least 10 miles in a day. So a 3 days walk would make the span of the city 30 miles across. As big or maybe bigger than well, let's say as big as Los Angeles, or as big as New York City from the Bronx down to Brooklyn. There was no city at all in the ancient world that had that span. You see how this has nothing to do with God's miracles.
Right.
It's just the dimensions of the story. Now, another detail is that when the king of Nineveh recognizes the truth of Jonah's moral denunciation and bids his entire population to fast and to put on sackcloth, he includes in the fast all the beasts owned by the Ninevites, and not only in the fast, but he bids the animals to wear sackcloth, and that's you see, it's a fantastic detail, and it's almost a comical detail. The point being to convey to the audience of the story the absolute comprehensiveness of the act of penitence undertaken by the Ninevites. But you can see that there is no way in which it could plausibly have happened that the animals fasted and the animals donned sackcloth. So I would put the 3 days in the belly of the fish as in the same category. That is, it's not an issue whether God can or cannot perform miracles. So that's a decision of faith, and I won't try to adjudicate that. But it's part of this fabulous, in the sense of fable, is part of this fabulous vehicle of storytelling, which is taken up by the author of Jonah. That is, the point is that in his story, he shows how a man who wanted to flee God, which of course is impossible, and wanted to shirk his prophetic calling, goes down to the very depths that he experiences something quite like death that seems utterly hopeless, and then he is rescued, and when he's rescued, he realizes he has to carry out his mission as a prophet.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I know we've got a couple other more technical questions, maybe about translation in Hebrew. But before we get to that, I just wanted to ask quickly, for sake of make sure we get this in. So if, for reasons you just discussed, asking or really diving into the question, did Jonah really happen? Is it historical? Might lead you to some misguided answers.
Yeah, I definitely believe that.
Yeah, so what would you say would be better questions we should be asking as readers coming to the book that will lead us down more helpful and more healthy avenues?
Oh, well, that's a good question. I would say, first, well, there are a couple of questions. One is, it's a fable about prophecy, but it's also a fable about moral responsibility. And in a way, this is something that we all face. That is, if let's take a current example. If we read in the paper about, or people don't read the newspaper so much anyway, hear in the news or see in the news that families are being separated at the Mexican border, and that thousands of children are put in what amount to detention centers, sometimes under horrendous experiences. Do we have some kind of responsibility to answer the calling of our conscience in contemplating these things? Okay, so that's really something that is addressed in the book of Jonah, beyond the specific mission of the prophet. But the other thing which seems maybe a larger concern, the book of Jonah really asks us to contemplate what it concretely means for God to be the God of all creation. That is, not just one particular nation, and also not just a certain spiritual elite, those who are chosen to be saved, but everybody, and not just everybody, but all living creatures. You remember the book of Jonah ends, and it's the only book in the Bible, and one of the few books in literature that ends this way. It ends with a question. That is, God says to Jonah, you had pity on this gourd, this kikayon plant, that one night was there and the next night was not. And shall I not have pity over a city of 600,000 human beings and all kinds of beasts? That's a very resonant thing, and it kind of puts the implications of monotheistic belief in a new, powerful light.
Right. It's as if it's like pointed, I don't know. I look at it this way, at least, and maybe you could correct me, but I kind of look at the book as that last question specifically. It kind of hangs with me, and it makes me wonder, do I care about all people the way God does?
Right. Well, I think that's exactly the kind of response that the writer wanted to get from his audience.
When you were giving some of your examples earlier, you were pointing out some of the ways that there's humor in the book, irony, repetition. What would you say are some different poetic or literary devices that you see used throughout the story of Jonah?
Okay, well, let me see. First, I would say there is the recurrence of going down. That is, there's almost a kind of opposition between standing up or rising, which is the first imperative verb that God speaks to Jonah. He says, "Arise, go and speak to the city of Nineveh." And by the way, speaking to the city of Nineveh is, as I think I say in my commentary, it's a little like telling a Jew, let's say in 1936, to go and speak to the people of Berlin and tell them they're on the wrong path. You can see why Jonah doesn't want to do it.
Right.
So there's anyway this rise up, which is what God expects of Jonah, and instead his response is a series of goings down. That is the verb to go down is repeated several times. First, he goes down from, we don't know where he is exactly, but it may well be Jerusalem, which is up in the hill country. And it says he goes down to Jaffa, which is the port city of ancient Palestine, and then he goes down into the far reaches of the ship, and then he goes down into the belly of the big fish, and then in a kind of antithetical movement, he comes back up.
That's really interesting that you bring that up, because I have heard before about the repetition of going down, but I've heard you say elsewhere that the first thing any character says in the Hebrew Bible is always really important. And I've never caught before that the very first thing God says is get up.
Right. The first thing that Jonah says is a little surprising. That is, I don't think he speaks until late in the first chapter. Of course, it's a very small, compact book. And the captain of the ship speaks to him and says, "What are you doing asleep?" Right? And I think, by the way, that the sleep is not something I commented on in print. Has a certain resonance. That is, it's a spiritual slumber as well as a literal sleeping. And also, if you think about it, we've all encountered this, I think, in our experience. That is, there are certain people that when they're faced with some terrible challenge or they're depressed, they just get into bed and they sleep. You know, it's a form of escape, right? And so the captain tells him, you know, what are you doing asleep? And he rouses him, and then they ask him who he is and what's his business, and he comes up with this rousing statement that is, I would say, kind of credo. That is, he says, "I am a Hebrew." By the way, I should alert readers that the designation Hebrew is pretty consistently used in the Bible when foreigners are referring to Israelites, or when someone is speaking to a foreigner and using the term that the foreigner would use. So he says, so therefore he doesn't say, I am of the people of Israel, or I am a Jew. He says, I am a Hebrew, and I fear the God of heaven and earth. And this is a slightly abbreviated quotation, but it's in that direction. Now, there's an almost comical contradiction between what these are Jonah's first words. So there's an almost comical contradiction between what Jonah says here and the way he's been acting so far. That is, he says he fears the God and it's that word, as in English, in God-fearing, means both to fear and to revere. He says he fears the God of heaven and earth, but what he's just done is to presume that God is not the God of heaven and earth, because you get away from him, and you don't have to do what he enjoins on you to do, and in a way, the whole story is then conceived to make Jonah confront the contradiction between what he said and what he's been doing, and maybe one hopes to actually implement his fear of the God of heaven and the God of earth, and to recognize that he is that.
That's amazing. This is Andrew. I showed up to the podcast a little late, so if you don't recognize this voice, it's not a rando walking in.
Okay, I hear it.
Hi. I read your book, The Art of Biblical Narrative, when I was a senior in college, and it really rocked my world. Learning to analyze the Bible through a more literary lens, whereas up to that point it was much more historical. And one of the things I loved about what I learned from that book is one of the examples is you talk about a biblical motif where the patriarchs all meet their wives, or a lot of them meet their wives at a well. And through that repetition and comparing and contrasting, you learn a lot about the character's personality traits, how that scene unfolds in comparison to the other patriarchs. And I was just wondering...
And of course, that scene is picked up in John's Gospel.
Right. And I was wondering, in the book of Jonah, are there any major biblical motifs the author is using or calling upon through allusions from elsewhere in the Old Testament? Is there anything like that in play in the book of Jonah?
Yeah, I would say that there is one central thing. That since Jonah is 4 short chapters, there's maybe not a lot of room to deploy many different conventions or motifs that you find in earlier biblical narrative. But, all the prophets, and this registers a kind of reality of the difficulty of prophecy. All the prophets about whom we have any details about their dedication as prophets don't want to undertake the task. Isaiah says, I am impure of lips, and in a people of impure lips I dwell, right? Jeremiah says, I am just a lad, and how could I undertake this huge task? and Moses says, send somebody else, boss. This is too much for me, and I am heavy-tongued. I don't have the articulateness that called upon for a prophet and a spiritual leader. So what Jonah does is to take that recurring scene of the resistance to the prophetic mission and push it much further. I find that interesting.
Yeah, I would love to ask you then, following up that, just because I've heard it go both ways, and I'm curious your personal opinion. Do you think Jonah actually has a change of heart in the fish, or no?
Well, in one way, we know he has a change of heart. And now, here's something interesting that happens with a change of heart. He has a change of heart because he realizes that as much as he would like not to do it, as much as he would like not to go to Nineveh for probably two reasons. One is that he's going into the heart of the enemy's empire, right? Which may be a scary thing. But the other thing is that he has this sneaking suspicion that if he delivers this prophecy to the Ninevites, which we get in a very compact form, in 40 days the city of Nineveh is to be overturned, which presumably if you don't renounce your evil ways, but that's not even spelled out. He has this sneaking suspicion that the Ninevites will listen to him, and then they will be saved. And he doesn't want them to be saved because they're the enemy. He hates them, right? God doesn't hate them, but he hates them. So he then, through the drastic experience of near death, he realizes first that he can't escape God. There's nowhere. It's like the Psalm where if I go up to, if I soar to the heavens, there you are. If I go down to the belly of the underworld, you were there. So he encounters the truth of that. So he realizes that he has to carry out the mission. So that is the change of heart, but it's only a partial change of heart. And that's what I find interesting, that there is a sort of human plausibility about Jonah's character. That is, he goes and carries out the task of prophecy, and then he sees that overnight the Ninevites renounce their evil ways. They fast. They put on sackcloth, and they're not going to behave like evil Ninevites anymore. But he still he harbors this sense of resentment and really probably hatred toward the Ninevites. What he would really like to see is the whole city with all the 600,000 people go up in flame like Sodom and Gomorrah. So he sits on that little promontory overlooking the city in his lean-to and waits to see what's going to happen, still hoping that what's going to happen is going to be really bad for the Ninevites. So that's what God then tells him at the end. It's not enough that you just go through the paces of delivering my words of castigation to the Ninevites, you have to also realize that they're human beings just like you, and you have to care about them as I care about them.
Right, and that's why, like, so often, if you hear, I don't know, I've heard Sunday school teachers try to sum up Jonah like the message is, be obedient like Jonah, and I just want to go, did you actually read the book? Like, he's not all that, he might carry it out anyway. But I also, like, part of me wonders, if not, like, it seems like the book of Jonah is unique in the fact that it's giving a prophetic message that, in a lot of ways what I take from it is Jonah is just a big finger pointing at the Israelites, saying, like, this is you are Jonah, in the way you're supposed to be a light to the nations, but over and over again you're running from that calling, and you're not treating the other nations or even amongst yourselves the way God has called you to. And I take that, then that finger is pointing at me also as I read it. Am I doing the same thing? And so, yeah, I feel like it cheapens it to boil it down to just obedience. And
yeah, I think that's absolutely right. In other words, to go back to what I said initially about the powerful message of universalism, the universalist perspective of monotheism, it's in that you can't be a xenophobe and a true believer in a universal God. So you have to give up the xenophobia.
Right. That's a super relevant message today. Absolutely. And that just plays to the power of narrative, is that it always has questions to ask for people in all different times. And speaking of modern readers reading an ancient book, and you've mentioned a lot of what the author of Jonah is doing in the Hebrew, but I would just love to hear more about how, as English readers, the sorts of things we miss out on when we only read the book in the English and we don't try to dive into what the story is doing in the Hebrew.
Well, that I don't know if I can readily illustrate this. I would say that the use of significant repetition, which is one of the major literary devices of biblical Hebrew, perhaps doesn't quite come through in the same way, and maybe there's something about the biblical Hebrew prose which manages to be very plain spun in a way. There's, in the narrative prose, and the poetry is rather different in this respect. In the narrative prose, fancy vocabulary is not used. A sort of primary set of terms is what the narrative depends upon, and yet it has a kind of haunting dignity. And I've tried to suggest some of that in my translation, but of course you can't get it entirely in another language.
Right.
What about the poem that is in chapter 2, like when Jonah is praying inside the fish? Like, is there anything going on in the Hebrew there that's just really hard to bring out in translation?
Well, yes, the poem is really a psalm. In fact, what it is, if you look at it very carefully, is that it's a Thanksgiving psalm. which is a little weird because it's presented in the story as Jonah's prayer in desperation in the belly of the fish, but actually he says that I was going down to the bottom of the sea, and you rescued me. So it lines up quite clearly with the Thanksgiving Psalms in the Book of Psalms. And this, I should say that it was a regular technique of literary composition in the Bible to insert certain texts into the text that you're writing because they made sense in the context. So, like quite a few of the Psalms used drowning or near drowning as an image for near death. So that's what made sense, and that's why it works, even if it's a little bit off in one respect. So I guess you get the resonance with the Thanksgiving Psalms, which is probably clearer in the Hebrew than it would be in English, and then you get because it's poetry, you get this very compact use of parallelism and rhythms and even a bit of internal rhymes. For example, I went down to the roots of the mountains. What is it? Weeds were round my head, which is that's pretty much my translation. That's not a bad approximation, but the Hebrew sounds better. The Hebrew is L'kitzvei harim yaradati. That's 3 accents in that half of the line. Then suf chavush l'roshi in the second half, just 3 words and 3 accents, and it has a lovely cadence that you can't quite get across in English.
Awesome. I'm curious. I've got a question for you, and then we'll kind of start gearing towards a wrap up here. Why do you think the ending is so abrupt?
I've always wondered about that myself. I would say that since it ends with an abrupt question and no answer from Jonah, it leaves us to question, maybe to question ourselves. That is, we say, wait a minute. If God has pity on 600,000 people, men, women, and children, and even on the animals that are living with them, where does that leave us? Should we emulate? Is there anything in us that is capable of emulating divine compassion?
Right.
And that, I think the abruptness of the question at the end helps us to wonder in that direction.
Right. Well, I've got one final question, and then we'll let you go. We want to honor the time. But again, on our podcast, we want to ask better questions that bring unity to different perspectives and call us into action. And with that in mind, I just wanted to end by asking if you have any just final thoughts for our listeners on how we should be looking not only at Jonah, but really the whole Old Testament, all of Scripture. How should we be open-handed, or how do we view it through a lens of unity to try it and how am I trying to say this question? We live in such polarizing times, and I wonder if you could just speak on how you think we should hold the scriptures to try and bring unity instead of division, or peace instead of argument.
Well, of course, the book of Jonah is a particularly good text to invoke in response to your question because of the universality of its message. But I would add something else which may sound peculiar, but I'll spell out what I mean briefly. I think, as you know, and in asking me about the art of biblical narrative, you've gestured in that direction. I have always tried to foster a literary approach to the Bible. Now, you might say, what does a literary approach have to do with the religious vision of the Bible, or with this kind of unifying you're talking about? Okay, I would put it this way. Let's just, poetry would be a complicating issue. I'll just focus on narrative. Okay, we all love stories. I mean, it is an activity of human culture. I don't think there are any human cultures that don't have storytellers. It engages us. It draws us in. Now, the biblical writers were, most of them, storytellers of genius. And what does this have to do with the religious imperative that led them to frame these stories? I think, surprising as it may sound to people whose notion of the Bible is, let's say, strictly theological or strictly Sunday schoolish, the artfully told stories were a way of not only drawing us in, but also in terms of, as I think we've seen in my response to some of your question about Jonah, in terms of complicating the religious message, showing its many facets, showing the contradictions and ambiguities of human nature itself under God's imperative. So that I think that the literary artfulness of the stories is a way to draw us all in, whatever our belief commitments, and then it's a way of getting us to understand with more subtlety and more profundity the religious messages of the stories.
I love that, Biz. I feel like when you look at it as a story, the emphasis becomes more about the questions you bring to it and the questions the text throws at you, and less about, hey, you need to see it this way. And it becomes a communal experience where you're all saying, this is what the story did to me and the questions it brought out of me, which is ultimately something we're trying to do through this podcast. And so I love that emphasis on the literary approach and the storytelling approach to the scriptures.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. If our listeners want to dive more into your work, where's the best place for them to find you?
Well, for a short take on my work, I would say my two books, The Art of Biblical Narrative and The Art of Biblical Poetry, are a good place to begin. And then I've done this is a much longer take. I've done this. I blush to admit 3,000-page, 3-volume work, which is a translation of the Hebrew Bible with pretty abundant commentary, and the more ambitious of your listeners might want to go there.
Yeah, I started that the other day just in preparation for this, right in Genesis, and I've really enjoyed it so far.
I'm glad.
Yeah.
Well, it's been very good talking with you.
You too. Thank you so
you.
much. We appreciate your time.
Yeah, it's been an honor. Well, that was our interview.
He's by far the smartest person who has and ever will be on this podcast. But if you liked this conversation and you want to hear more, follow us on our podcast stream. You can find us on iTunes, pretty much anywhere that has podcasts nowadays. And you can find us on Facebook at the Better Questions Podcast on Facebook. Yeah, so see you next week.